Following the recent reveal of Fire Emblem Three Houses, the second Warrior spin-off featuring fighters from the Fire Emblem series, there has been much debate amongst fans about who exactly will be playable in the game. It's obvious that, from the trailer, the game will feature primarily returning Three Houses characters, but the exact extent of the roster is unclear. My name is Vantage Emblem, and today, we're going to be attempting to predict the roster of characters that will be present in Fire Emblem Warriors Three Houses. Oh, and before we start, if you want more videos like this, remember to subscribe. That being said, let's get into it and start by talking about the base roster. We can start with what we know for almost certain, that at least the main house leaders from Three Houses, Claude, Edelgard, and Dimitri, will be playable. We've seen gameplay footage of all of them from the player's control. However, it seems unclear if they're separated by routes or all playable at once. At present, it seems like the situation may be a combination of both, perhaps split routes at first that all join back together at the end. The way this is handled could have a drastic impact on the roster. If the different houses are split into different routes, the roster for each of the Lord's houses will likely need to be close to complete in order to have an appropriate amount of characters per route. If they are not, the developers could possibly leave out a handful of characters if they wanted a smaller cast. Though I think that would be a poor choice on their end, as it has the potential to disappoint certain fans. If supports return in this game, even if presented in a fashion similar to the first Fire Emblem Warriors where there was only one written/voice support per character pair, and if you were able to have control over all of the main lords at once, perhaps we could actually get an opportunity to see supports between them. A Dimitri and Edelgard support would be hugely interesting, and a Dimitri and Claude or Edelgard and Claude support could also be quite fascinating. As for the rest of the cast, my personal preference would be to include every major Three Houses character, but it remains to be seen if this will be the route chosen. We do have a pretty good guess that at least the Lord's retainers, Hubert, Dedue, and Hilda, will return and be playable, due to their direct appearance in the trailer. The most obvious is Hubert, sporting a dramatic new look, who is very clearly alongside Edelgard. We also see Hilda later on, swinging her axe in a scene alongside Claude, and a gauntleted hand helping Dimitri that's speculated to be Dedue's. It would make sense that each of these retainers would return and be playable, especially given their prominence in the storyline of the original game. However, they are not officially confirmed as playable yet, as we have only seen them in cutscenes, but we can say it's pretty much almost certain. As for the rest of the house members, they remain a great unknown at the moment. Currently, we have no confirmation as to who will even be in the game, but I think we can make a good guess that any of the students that receive time-skip affected designs in the original Three Houses and show up in this game likely have new designs, just like the house lords and retainers we have already seen. Excluding the lords and the retainers, each house has only 6 additional units at base, meaning that it's totally plausible to see at least all of the core house students playable. Frankly, I think this will be the case at the very least. This means we could easily see Ferdinand, Petra, Caspar, Dorothea, Bernadetta, and Linhardt of the Black Eagles, Annette, Sylvain, Felix, Ingrid, Ash, and Mercedes of the Blue Lions, and Lysithea, Raphael, Lorenz, Marianne, Leonie, and Ignatz of the Golden Deer as playable units with new mid-time skip designs. Whether or not they will be recruitable between houses if there is a route split is indeterminate. As for another character who appears only in cutscenes and appears prominently, we have Bileth, specifically female Bileth. Bileth is more than likely the main playable character in this game, based on the cutscenes we've seen and on how she's featured in the box art alongside her role in the original Three Houses. Though, again, we have yet to see gameplay footage of her. And above that, male Bileth is nowhere to be seen. I'll link my video on the top right talking about the potential places where he could be in the game, but I think it's quite possible that he could just be a skin for female Bileth, with the female Bileth being the canon Bileth, to make the game only need to feature one set of cutscenes with one main character, and I think that's a smart move. For Academy staff other than Bileth, be it knights, teachers, or otherwise, there is a great deal of debate as to whether they will be playable or not. While it's pretty likely we will see all, or at least most, of the students as playable, the Academy staff is more of a toss-up, even though many of them are quite popular and they could easily flesh out a church army. The 9 playable characters associated with the Church of Seros in the original Three Houses are the most likely to return, with Sedith, Flayn, Hanuman, and Manuela arguably the most likely out of the bunch. Shamir, Catherine, Alois, Cyril, and Gilbert perhaps a little less likely, but still easily possible. Jaritza is quite possibly playable as well. Given trailer footage, a good guess could be made that Geralt might possibly even be playable, perhaps revived in some form or another, maybe even first possessed by an enemy. Perhaps Lady Rhea will be playable in this game, active as a general in the war, maybe in her Seros garb. Or maybe she can change into the Immaculate One as a boss fight, depending on how the story goes. I mean, it's already been shown in the cutscene from the new title, and, we may even see the family members of our main characters that were mentioned but never shown in the original game, such as Hilda's brother, Holst, or Casper's father, either as playable characters or unplayable NPCs. We may even see Adrestian characters such as Ladislava, Randolph, and Fletch as playable, or returning NPCs. And the same holds true for Judith and Rodrigue from the Leicester Alliance and the Holy Kingdom of Fargus, respectively. Provided there are supports amongst most playable characters, any of these more obscure characters being playable may yield a great deal of unexpected depth for these units by, having supports for the first time, allowing them to have many different connections and interactions with other characters that can flesh out their motivations, desires, wants, needs, whatever else. Jumping ship to a different idea, more of a stretch, we could possibly see a playable Sothis, maybe even restored to an adult form through the game's events. This is something I see as more unlikely given her juxtaposition with what seems to be a dark god on the box art, but I think it's still worth mentioning. Speaking of this apparent dark god and what seems to be her vessel, we could also see a new, wholly original playable character as well. This dark, enlightened one we've seen before could very easily be an unlockable villain, or perhaps they're just an unplayable villain. The original Fire Emblem Warriors had a mixture of both new playable characters and new characters that were unplayable, so this is not entirely out of the question. I want to sidebar for a second to talk about a cool theory I saw brought up in my comment section for the last video on this upcoming title. Perhaps this dark goddess is Zaharas, the progenitor of the forbidden spell of Zaharas, used by Solon in the original Three Houses. I think this could provide an excellent bit of continuity and clarity were it to be the case, but we'll have to wait and see. It also could be one of the dark gods that supposedly Nemesis, the King of Liberation, fought off, although that story is false. Anyway, there's more to say about the villains too, and whether or not they will be playable characters, unplayable NPCs, or even in the game. First, there's a character that a lot of folks are quick to point out looks just like Monica. She could be a new character, a family member of Monica, or perhaps the real Monica, or Kranya disguised as Monica. If she is Monica, much like the main students that we've seen already, she's getting a redesign, which makes sense with what we've seen of the game thus far. If she's Kranya designed as Monica, that could lend itself to a significantly different path of events from the main game. She would represent those who slither in the dark, as Kranya is an Agarthan. Whether she is playable or not remains to be seen, but again, if she is, this could lead to some interesting supports. We could potentially see some other members of those who slither in the dark as well, but whether they just be villains or actual playable, supportable characters is up for debate, though I think we're assuming it's the former. The original Warriors had villains with fleshed out movesets and models that could have been playable, but they weren't, presumably over the issue of giving these characters supports. The same may be true here. With that, we've roughly covered the bulk of Three Houses characters, but there's more yet to discuss. First, you've probably noticed at this point that we've just been talking about what characters could be in the game, not what classes they will be, and that's because there's a few different routes the developers could have taken with this, which I'd like to discuss now. The original Three Houses had a rather flexible class system that allowed any playable unit to become any class. The developers could choose to ignore this and assign characters to their canon classes found when they were enemies in alternate routes, or from the Cinder Shadows DLC. Or they could choose to embrace their flexible class design, designing movesets for whole classes rather than characters, and letting players freely craft their army. I think the latter option is better for replayability if the developers wish to go the route of having clone characters, or characters that play extremely similarly / the exact same to save on development time, like with several members of the cast in the original Fire Emblem Warriors. However, there are a number of development challenges that likely come along with that. The game could instead feature unique, or mostly unique movesets for each character alongside their canon class line, but it may take away from player agency. Either of these options are, in my opinion, good options. What I worry about is a middle ground approach with many clone characters and yet no class freedom, which could easily make the game stale. Having plenty of unique movesets to play around with makes Warriors games a lot more fun. Second, a lot of people seem to believe that there could be characters from other games other than Three Houses in the base roster of this new Warriors game, much like the original Fire Emblem Warriors drew from multiple games. I think this is very unlikely. The original Warriors had a lot of backlash for its roster not drawing from enough games, given that it was drawing from multiple games. So, sticking to one game is probably a great way to avoid this backlash from a PR and game development perspective. This game seems to be following the Age of Calamity model, where it's adapting a single game in an ongoing franchise and leveraging content from solely that game. This can be seen on the official website for the game, which specifically claims that Edelgard, Dimitri, Claude, and other Fire Emblem Three Houses characters return, rather than characters from across the Fire Emblem series. If, for some reason, the developers were to bring in outside characters, I think many people would honestly find themselves upset that this is no longer a Fire Emblem Three Houses story. That being said, if outside characters were to be brought in, it probably would only be through DLC. Though, as we'll talk about in just a moment, I think there's better DLC candidates for a game like this. That being said, I think there's a good chance we don't even see all of the main Three Houses characters back for this game based on development time and costs, and the chances that we see outside characters as anything other than DLC is frankly slim to none. Given the fact that we more than likely will not see a complete Three Houses base roster if we also have characters from other games in the franchise, I would rather not see them in the main game. I'd also prefer if all the students didn't have their own individual movesets, and instead got their movesets based on the class, as I think that's the best way for the developers to be able to include all of the different students and teachers from Three Houses, with all of the development resources going into making them individual aesthetically and as characters, without having to put any time into individual movesets for each of them. That being said, we now must pose this question. Will we see DLC for this game? And if so, who will be in it? I think if anyone's likely to be DLC fighters, it's the Ashen Wolves from the DLC of the original Three Houses, alongside any students that are cut from the main cast, should any be cut at all. These characters could have their own mid-time skip designs, much like the other characters we've seen so far in Three Hopes, and they would all be a fine addition to the roster. I doubt the Ashen Wolves would make it into the base game, but I think DLC could be a great place for them that would make many, many players happy.
Oh, haha, look, it's funny because I said happy and it's happy. Yeah, aren't I smart and original?
Any teachers and staff that are missing could also be DLC, and villains could be made playable as DLC as well. I have my doubts about a playable gatekeeper in the base roster, but he'd be great as a DLC character. In addition, I think Anna could be a fine choice for a DLC fighter, given she was DLC in the last two non-remake mainline Fire Emblem games, was a big part of the DLC of the Fire Emblem game before that, and generally likes money, which you'd have to spend to unlock her. It's rather fitting. The only other characters that I could really see on the roster are, well, characters from other Fire Emblems, or incidental NPCs from Three Houses that die after the time skip, such as Gwendol. I could see the latter as more likely, the former unlikely at all, but only time will tell. That being said, given what we've talked about today, should Koei Tecmo use even a fraction of the potential roster, we could have a really good cast in our hands that far exceeds the original Fire Emblem Warriors. I figure we'll find out as we get closer to the game's release, and in just a few short months, we'll have it all figured out when the game is in our hands. Anyhow, I'll stop rambling and end things here. If you enjoyed this video and want to support the channel, I'd recommend subscribing. It's totally free. That being said, thank you so much for watching. My name is Vantage Emblem. I bet you're as excited for this game as I am, and I hope you have a great rest of your day. Take care.